Welcome everyone to this second event. It's good to see you all. I'm Jonathan Rice and I'm Chief Executive and co-founder of Perspectiva. Perspectiva is a publisher and we're very proud to publish Iain's book. This is the second volume of the Matter with Things here. Perspectiva does other things too though. We're a charity based in London. And our general emphasis is on sort of trying to reimagine the world from first principles, giving people permission to do that, social and intellectual permission and encouragement to rethink the world. And we see this as a sort of necessary kind of work that we have to do today. And that brings with it certain events, and we have an annual festival. We have a European network called Emerge. We have a methodology we call the anti-debate. And we're in the business of creating some course material that we hope to start sharing with you all soon. So watch this space for further developments on Perspectiva. And in the chat, maybe Michael can just share our website if anyone's interested to know a little bit more about us. I wanted to say a few things before Zak and Iain speak, and then I'm going to disappear in the digital sense of no longer being on your screen. The first is to thank, tonight's event is free, and that's partly because we were given a grant to help bring Iain's work to more public attention and to inquire more deeply into the material in the Matter with Things. So I'm very grateful to the Inspiration Incubator, particularly Nikki and Max, which has made it possible for these events to be free. And there are going to be, there's already been one, this is the second, there's going to be double figures events. We don't yet know if it's 10 or 12 or 15, but we're going to be in that sort of magnitude of events, because there's a lot to discuss in Iain's book and because we want to do something a little bit different. In essence, Iain's work sort of came to public attention around 2011, some 13 or 12 or so years ago. And since then, as someone who's followed his work closely, the wonderful thing is that it's coming to public attention, the big idea, the main idea, the hemispheric hypothesis. But that's been a good decade now, a good decade of questions clarifying what exactly Iain means. What's the difference between the right and left hemisphere? How does it play out in the world? And there's still a place for that. There's a lot of people catching up with the significance of that and why it's a world-changing insight when you understand properly what Iain's saying. But it's also true that Iain has moved along and deepened the inquiry and in a more specific way applied his understanding to particular areas. And they need greater attention on their own terms. So in this seminar series, there's a kind of presumption, although we will reiterate and restate the argument as we go, we're trying to move beyond, let's say, McGilchrist 101. We're trying not to be simply, this is the main thesis. Can I ask you again about that, please? We're trying to assume a level of understanding and engagement with the work that allows us to move it on. And when I say move it on, I mean move it on philosophically to really understand more deeply what's being said. But I also mean move it on kind of in a more quasi-applied or proto-applied sense, because there's a lot of risk in rushing too quickly to understand what might follow from Iain's work. But there's also a need to begin to figure out what it means for each of us in our personal and professional and even political lives. And with that in mind, the first event was trying to frame the purpose of the series as a whole, and that was called Attention as a Moral Act. And I also introduced what I called the McGilchrist maneuver. And there's a little blog post about what the McGilchrist maneuver is, I think, and that can be shared in the chat too. And that's a way of trying to get people to orient towards how we begin to think about the places where Iain's work makes sense in the public realm, what value it might have for civil society rethinking things. And we're continuing that tonight. And just so you know, as a sort of little bit of a preamble, we have future events relating to sanity and imagination. So we're trying to zoom in on particular issues that are dealt with in great depth in Iain's books, but which are also of a sort of have a degree of salience and relevance and tangibility in the real world. We don't want to be in the simple business of because Iain says X, we should do Y, because Iain would be the first to say that's not how it is. But we are interested in the shift of perception that arises from Iain's work and how that begins to look in different contexts and in different thematic areas. And tonight we're on a really big one, values. Value, and this is one of the things I want Iain and Zak to help clarify for us, because when I reread, by the way, if any of you are wondering about the reading material for tonight or what to read after tonight to sort of cover the ground again, chapter 26 in the second volume of The Matter with Things is particularly relevant to what you're about to hear. And it's Iain and Zak will go into it in more depth, but it's a philosophical take on what value is, where it comes from, why it matters, and the extent to which it can be perceived directly. And the reason I think I wanted to inquire into this question is because values are, mentioned everywhere. If you're working in a sort of civil society space, as I am, everyone's speaking about trying to work on values for campaigning. There's a values and frames company that think about messaging to try and get particular values encoded in the language you use. Political strategy is full of tapping into implicit values. In the commercial world, the world of commercial ethics, if you order food from, for example, Waitrose in the UK, you hear that they have their chicken, eggs, and milk come from farmers who share our values, right? And then, of course, if you're working in the business world or the finance world, you hear a lot about the value proposition of something and the bottom line being about shareholder value. So this word value kind of permeates society in lots of different ways, but it's used maybe without adequate reflection to really understand what's going on. I'd like one of the things for Iain and Zak to clarify is this sort of distinction between values singular and values plural. I hope that will come up at some point in the discussion. And also kind of what I sense as a kind of big transcendent sense of value, almost value as equivalent with Tao or God or something like that. And then a kind of value that's something to do with truth, beauty, and goodness, and maybe love, and maybe meaning and purpose, the kind of fundamental values. And then there's sort of derivative values like pleasure and maybe integrity and things like that. I'm curious to understand the kind of reverberations of those things and the connections between them. With that said, it's a great pleasure to introduce both of our speakers. Now, Iain, I think, goes pretty much without saying for the audience here. He is inter alia the author of The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things. He's a well-known polymathic scholar and public speaker. Zak Stein may be a little less known, but for those who do know him, it's hugely exciting to give him a chance to speak with Iain. I have known Zak now for about 4 to 5 years, and we went to the same graduate school, although my sense of talking with Zak is always that I've heard of the books that he's actually read. That's usually my feeling of encountering Zak. He's a very studious, very erudite fellow, really engages very deeply with all the material that he touches. So when he speaks with a great deal of authority because it comes from a lot of study and consideration. He is, among many other things, one of the co-founders of the Civilization Research Institute. He is working on a lot of different books, but I happen to know as publisher that he has a manuscript in preparation that relates to metaphysics, which is one of the reasons I thought he was particularly well placed to talk with Iain tonight. He's also a philosopher of education, and he's written several essays for Perspectiva, which you can, again, we'll share with you in the chat in due course. So I think that's all from me, if I haven't forgotten anything. I hope I've made sense of a thank you to our main sponsors, why we're having this series at all, why tonight's event matters most, and why our speakers are great. And with that, I can disappear for 45 to 50 minutes and let you enjoy Iain and Zak's company. I'll see you later on. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah. Well.
So it's a pleasure to talk. I've never spoken before, so it's kind of interesting to have a first conversation so publicly.
It's great.
Jonathan mentioned that I'm working on a book on metaphysics. I have training in cognitive developmental psychology as a neo-Piagetian. And so when I encountered your work, it was actually like that experience of someone saying something that I almost completely agreed with, where there was just this complete absorption of the book and all of it, both volumes and the prior work. And what was interesting to me was that in my own experience, And in the branches of psychology that I explored and philosophy that I explored, value was a given. And so the skepticism and cynicism about value that I encountered in postmodernism and even some forms of modernism was actually kind of like, I didn't understand it. But I also encountered people who didn't understand value as a given, right? So when I got to the places in your work where it was clear that there were hemispheric dominance patterns that were expressing themselves across these different philosophical positions, and even in the personalities of the people who are holding them, lights went off. So I'm just kind of thanking you for your work before I get into it.
Thank you very, very much. I hope the lights went on as well. Yes. Anyway, no, thank you very much. And yes, I look forward to talking about these things. Perhaps I should just begin, unless you've got a question lined up. Have you got a question lined up?
I had a prompt. I had a prompt, which was
go ahead.
Page 1122. And so this is the second volume. This is the chapter on value. You say something, and it's just a simple sentence, but it's very, very profound, which is that you are placing value as equally primordial with time, space, matter, and motion and consciousness.
Yes.
And so
yes.
This is when you think about what is the universe, what is reality? Time, space, matter, motion. Sure, everyone kind of buys that. Consciousness, you can get people to do that. Placing value as equally primordial to those elements of cosmos is core to the work that I'm doing in metaphysics at the Center for Integral Wisdom with Gaffney and Wilbur. And it's core to the work that I was doing as a psychologist, as a Piagetian, where he was in part with moral judgment and Kohlberg. What they were looking at was valueception, was the ability of the organism itself to perceive the field of value. So Kohlberg was a moral realist. He believed that you equilibrated your moral judgment to a moral reality, the way you equilibrate your sensory motor intelligence to gravity. Like gravity exists, so you operate on gravity as a kid, and you learn to work and navigate space and time with your body. Kohlberg's basically saying, and you do a similar thing with moral reality, with the field of value. You learn from it. It's not a simple instruction. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the philosophical lineage that has always held that as true. Because my sense is that most humans in most cultures, with most philosophies and worldviews and religions, held this as true. It's only mostly recently in modernity that the default position has been a value cynicism or value skepticism. And so I wonder if you could kind of underline that point that yes, value is like space, time, matter, motion, really primordial, constitutive of universe.
Yes, well, I believe it to be so. I felt that people would, and I'm glad you have that reaction. Think, goodness, you've talked about all these things that everyone agrees are constitutive of the cosmos, but now you're talking about things like value, purpose, and the sense of the sacred, which are my last three chapters. And I left them to that point because I thought that if people understood enough about what I'd said earlier about the more commonly accepted foundations of reality, they would probably see why I would consider these things also as foundational. The chapter is called Value, not Values, as Jonathan pointed out, because I'm not really talking in this chapter about which particular everyday values we might consider to be the more important ones. I think there is a discussion to be had about values, but often values boils down to objectives. And that objective is often economic, as Jonathan pointed out. And I don't think values are objectives exactly. An objective is something that in the left hemisphere where you target, you find a line to go to it and achieve it. Whereas what I'm talking about is something that is, I believe, impossible to do without. I mean, it's not an invention. It is something that is there in the ground of our being. We don't, I think, a very important starting point is I don't believe that we invent values and paint them onto reality in order to cheer ourselves up, but that we actually discover values. They are there for the discovery. We either respond to them or we don't. And perhaps that would take us too far from this discussion, which hasn't even got going on value yet. But I do argue that the purpose of life, the reason the cosmos brings into being something quite so counterintuitive as life, with all its problems, is that it is the ability to bring forth in that cosmos something that can respond to these primordial values. So I think I start by saying something like, so consciousness is not what life brings, because I've suggested in a previous chapter that consciousness is everywhere in the universe, and that's becoming not an unusual point of view. It's, of course, very widely been accepted for thousands of years, particularly in the East, but it's now being accepted much more in the mainstream of analytic Anglo-American philosophy. But the idea of value is, I think there are a number of aspects to it, really. And perhaps if I just say something about what I take it that we generally believe and something about what I am going to argue or what I do argue there, that would help. There are about half a dozen of them. And one I've mentioned, which is this idea that we don't invent but discover it. And related to that is that it is not a cognitive derivation. It is not something that we look at life and then we attach certain sort of things and we call those values, but we have this ability to be in touch with something which is an ontological primitive. And we do it through what you've already mentioned, this concept of valueception, which I believe is a translation from the German of Max Scheler, who invented a word in German which didn't, until he made it up, exist, which is Wahrnehmung. No, sorry, Wahrnehmung is perception, but Wertnehmung, which is valuing. And so Wertnehmen is really a version of Wahrnehmung, which is a perfectly straightforward German word for perception. But the link with perception is interesting, because when we perceive things, we don't take in a piece of data passively. We're not like receptive plates that absorb data and then do a calculation on it and have a response. We immediately, as it were, get an idea of what it is that we're dealing with here. And in fact, we go to meet it, which is another interesting idea. So it's disclosed in a precognitive take on the gestalt of what we are seeing. It's not calculated. And this is particularly important when it comes to my understanding of morality itself, of goodness. It's now been for a long time normal within the mainstream of Western academe to consider that anyone who espouses another view of morality than utilitarianism must be making a fundamental mistake. But utilitarianism is exactly the kind of morality that is made simply out of making a calculation of what results from it. And that perhaps brings sharply into focus what I'm talking about. It's not about a result. It's not about a calculation towards a known goal. It is a something that evokes in us a reverberative relationship. So it calls to us, and it calls to us from in front. So it is in that sense rather like a final cause rather than efficient cause. Most of our thinking is to do with an efficient cause, which is what pushes us from behind, the thing that makes us do something in the way that one would make a machine do something. I know you know all this, Zak, but I'm just saying it for everyone's benefit. Whereas a final cause is a cause that brings you to do something because you have a relationship with it. It's not a self-generated concept, but it is another. And that's a very important part of what I'm saying. And there are just a couple of things more to say, and then I'll hand back to you. One is that this makes it something that is not determined, but is free. We can choose to respond or not, and we can choose what we believe actually fulfills each of these values? So I mentioned that there are goals or objectives or targets or things we like to do, and which ones we decide are beautiful, good, or true is another conversation, an important one. But I'm talking here about the very fact of there being beauty, goodness, and truth at all. And the last point I'd like to make is that utilitarian thinking, which is in fact the value of the left hemisphere, that of utility, means that values are designed to make us do something that is evolutionarily beneficial. So beauty is just a way of making us choose the right mate or whatever. Truth is, the idea of truth is just something that's made up by a powerful hierarchy to dragoon people into following it. And perhaps goodness is in the same league. Now, what I'm saying is that truly understood, properly understood, these values are fulfilled in being responded to in themselves, not for any further purpose beyond that. So if I leave it at that as a sort of laying out my stall, you can now pick it apart.
No, I think it's, like I said, I agree with so much of what you're saying. And it's one of the things that I think clarifies the nature of value as you're trying to express it as a basic property of the cosmos. It's something I write about in this work that Jonathan was speaking to. It is that it pre-exists the human, right? Because if you're a postmodernist, you take value as a social construction, then there's basically nothing that looks like value until a human emerges, and then we create value systems and we use them to oppress people or whatever you do with that. But the take here is that actually no, life emerged to respond to value which pre-existed it. So I think of Whitehead spoke of the appetition of the cosmos, that the cosmos had an appetite, that it wanted something, that it moved towards something. And so that the evolutionary process responds to value makes it teleological. And it also means that there's a dimension in biological evolution that is responding to the same field of real value that we are responding to. And that's, I think, again, a position that humans have believed before. Like I think of natural law theory. It's not a great instance of it, but natural law is a case of that. And I think of religious systems where the ordering of the cosmos, you participated in it as a microcosm, so that there was this continuity of value across life and human and divine. So it's interesting that the power of the left hemisphere to reify a worldview that is so much a minority position respective to most of human thought. It is one of the things that strikes me, because again, there's something about socialization or early childhood education or the nature of the things that get the left hemispheric dominance put in place. There's a type of personality that hasn't been domesticated to that by the educational system. It's not clear why that occurs. And for them, arguments about value, as I'm making here, seem actually they like them. It makes you feel good. You feel like you're at home in the universe. Like the things you care about actually matter to the universe. And then there's another personality type, let me say, which is deeply skeptical, cynical of that view. In fact, anything that would make you feel at home in the universe is probably proof that it's not science, right? Anything that would make you feel comfortable thinking about the emergence of human value from biological evolution would be odd. So I guess
and that's a
yeah, please. No, I'm just kind of prompting.
No, that's of course a case of petitio principii, isn't it? I mean, it seems like it must be wrong because science starts from the standpoint that, of course, all this has to be viewed as objectively alien to us.
Right.
And so it discovers that it is, curiously enough, alien. After much looking for things that it has ruled out from the start, like purpose and real values, it finds that these things can't exist. Or if you hold that they do exist, you can't be being scientific. Well, I mean, I've tried to argue from science and philosophy for these very concepts themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's there. You can see it in the science if you read it from a different angle,
Mm.
essentially.
Can I mention Darwin? Because people will, we're talking about evolution. You raised biology.
Thanks.
And one of the things that I love about Darwin, apart from anything else, is that he was motivated in his study by beauty, and that in his earlier writings, beauty is already beauty or beautiful occurs on 1 in 6 of his pages, but in his final writings, it occurs on average every other page. He uses the term beauty or beautiful. He's constantly referring to it, and twice he puzzles over it, because he says it's all very well to say that birds choose a mate because they find them beautiful, and that, of course, in itself suggests that it doesn't just arise with us humans. But the existence of beauty itself remains a mystery. I mean, what that observation addresses is, given the existence of beauty, how can it be made useful to evolution? But it doesn't answer the question, how does beauty come about and what does it lie in?
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. Darwin also writes a lot about love, and I bet they co-occur with beauty.
It does.
This dynamic of allurement and attraction in the animal kingdom.
Not as much, but yes.
Yeah, and the plenitude of nature in the creation of beautiful things, because it's not just that the bird appears beautiful to the other bird, it also appears beautiful to us, which seems extravagant. Like, why would it be that the human nervous system responds so immediately to
completely
these things that yeah.
This is a point I make. I mean, that why is it that the things that birds and animals find beautiful, we also find beautiful, even though they have no relevant. I mean, the fact that a bird has certain colors doesn't, or a plant. In fact, a plant that is poisonous may be very beautiful. So it's not a matter of being evolutionarily beneficial. It just is beautiful. And another thing is trees. The shape of trees. The shapes of trees are intrinsically beautiful to humans. They've been commented on since time immemorial. But there's nothing about the shape of a tree that can in any sense be attractive from a propagation of the species point of view. Of course, they need insects, but don't tell me insects are going around going, that elm is just exquisite. In the way
and why would my nervous system evolve to be appreciative of the beauty of the tree? And
indeed,
and it certainly is. And so that notion of kind of like moving the utilitarian calculus down into evolutionary explanation, and therefore believing that everything that's here, like my whole body and mind, evolved for this very narrow function, is in fact incorrect. That if value exists us and life responds to value, then it's reasonable that we optimized actually biologically, neurologically, for love, beauty, right? A whole host of values that we actually have the ability to respond to. And so valueception, this gets to a question, valueception is like a skill. Like valueception can be trained. And when you think of aesthetic perception, I had training as it was in music actually, where I so desperately wanted to have certain albums in my possession and to like expose myself to beautiful things, specifically jazz and Indian classical music. Whereas why would I work a job at a coffee shop specifically to get money just to buy these things? So the intrinsic value and the appreciation. So this question of, how do you build valueception? Why is it that our schools, for example, seem to inhibit it, that the culture seems to actually create the opposite, where things that have no value get perceived as having value, is one way of even describing the commodity form itself, that you perform a trick. Now you have the exchange value overriding the actual use value, as it were. So how do we get better valueception? How do we avoid being confused?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, because like so many things, it's not black and white in that valueception can only exist once it's been trained. But it's also true that it can be trained. but it is intrinsic. So I think children, without any instruction, find certain things beautiful and certain animals, for example, beautiful. And they also find some ugly. And this is an important point to make, because something that might be said is, well, you find all these beautiful things in nature just because we're trained that whatever is natural is beautiful. Absolutely not. Although most of nature manages to remain extremely beautiful, there are certainly lots of things in nature that are just plain ugly. And in the book, I'm afraid I draw attention to the rather unattractive features of the shoe-billed stork, I seem to remember. I mean, there it is. It's an entirely natural bird creation, but it's not a very attractive one, I think, to most people. So I think they're intrinsic. And also goodness. I mean, goodness is obviously culturally determined to a point, but this can be exaggerated. I mean, there are very few cultures in the world where it's considered good to murder and rape. In fact, beauty too is far more culturally universal than is made out by people who want to impress on us that it's simply made up. Most Eastern peoples, Chinese and Japanese, for example, find no problem whatever in enjoying the works of art in Western works of art in our museums, coming to the plays of Shakespeare. We find no problem at all in going in the beauty of their art and their culture. So, and interestingly, it's also true that things can be found that quite specifically mean things that are intrinsic. So, for example, certain intervals and shapes and melodies in an Indian raga can be understood by Norwegians who know nothing about Indian music. If they're asked to say, what is it that this is expressing, they are remarkably similar to what an Indian listener trained would say that was being expressed. So, I mean, that's a scientifically verified result. So I think it's like so many things that you can have a basic understanding of something, but what we can do is help it to flourish and grow in beneficial directions. And this is a little bit like anything that grows. A plant can grow and will grow anyway, but a gardener can actually make plants thrive more and can make them grow to another shape or to another size or to another color. So there is a way in which whatever is there can be trained by us, but that doesn't mean that it's made up by us. I believe that Goethe is right when he says that everything properly considered and appreciated by us calls out in us the faculty with which we can appreciate it. And so, for example, you talked about music, and I imagine your experience is the same as mine, that when one starts learning to love music, one loves certain things that one perhaps still loves, but one can't necessarily immediately respond to other things. That as one learns more and more, the faculty in us to appreciate them grows.
Yeah, the deepening of value, one way to think about human development. The human development is just a maturation, if you will, is this deepening of appreciation of more and more value, and it's not the making up more things to care about. It's the getting deeper in touch with reality. It's actually deepening into this field of value, which, and again, from a human development perspective, it does seem that it's a disposition that is deeply rooted value centered. And that a lot of what occurs is just the absence of support for that skill and things that counteract it, which is to say anti-value. So like preference, preference falsification is the root of advertising, and advertising suffuses our environment. So there's a intentional thing in our culture to actually disrupt the ability to truly perceive value. So it's a thing that we need to think about, like, how do we protect ourselves from being confused and then sit and appreciate, and how does that actually work? Even just the ability to hold attention for a long period of time is necessary for certain levels of appreciation of value and beauty, right? So like if you
which is another reason why attention is a moral act, as we have called this series, which is a phrase that I think I use in both The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things.
Yeah. So I'm right there. The implication also, another implication and kind of a question is, so therefore, if we really downgrade valueception, like let's say value collapses at the center of culture, which is a little bit you could say is occurring, that we've kind of burnt off the fumes of pre-modernity and we're running out of a center of value in nature, and even the ability to then perceive value. That's very dangerous. Like, if part of what evolution has been is adapting us to perceive and relate to value, if we cut off that ability, then we become evolutionarily non-adaptive, which means we go extinct. So another place that this work that I'm doing is the relationship between value and existential risk, right? And civilizational collapse, which is that the patterns you're pointing to are actually deep generator functions of existential risk, if you will. Let me drop into that vocabulary, saying like the inability to perceive the simplification of problem to narrow metric, right? The mischaracterization of a complex thing as a complicated thing that could be fixed, but actually you can't intervene.
Exactly.
All of those characteristics are things that are leading us to a point in civilization that is treacherous.
Yes.
So there's an urgency, and I see it as an educational urgency to figure out how to rebalance the hemisphere. And that's why I'm focusing on valueception as like, what can we actually do to allow ourselves to perceive what's actually valuable again? Because we're clearly very confused about what's valuable. If we've been brought to a place where our civilization is about to self-destruct. And AI is a great example.
Right.
The core of the AI risk is the alignment problem, which is a values alignment problem, which is so that's me kind of saying, help us save civilization, Iain. How do we learn to perceive value again so that we don't?
Thanks. Yes. Yes, I can't remember who it is, but you can probably tell me in Silicon Valley who said that, yes, the way AI is going will probably render us extinct, but it'll be very good for the economy in the meantime. And that perhaps sums up the left hemisphere's approach to these things. It only understands power, control, utility, and as a sort of subset of that, pleasure, which is assumed to be what these things give, although, by the way, they don't. People who have as much power as you can conceivably imagine are lead unhappy, anxious lives. But there we are. I can tell you for free as a psychiatrist. But yes, how do we get back on course? Well, partly, of course, you won't be surprised to hear me say that even below the fixing of values is this business of the hemisphere balance, because you mentioned there the idea of a complicated machine that can be fixed versus a complex system, which is the difference being that a complex system is intrinsically indeterminate. It is intrinsically free. It is intrinsically not controllable. It is intrinsically able to move in a way that we can't actually program. So that is a kind of slap in the face to those who hold this left hemisphere view that we can make ourselves all powerful. And for me, the most heinous thing that has happened in the last 200 years, or perhaps even since the Enlightenment, is this belief that we can control everything, that we have power. And if only we could have humility enough to understand how little we know, how little we really understand what we're dealing with, and how helpless we will be in the face of things that we are now setting loose, then it might not be too late to do something about it. So regaining some sense of humility and awe before what it is we're seeing, respect for these things, not the whole idea that we make them all up, of course, is a version of this idea that we are the creators of everything we see. We are the creators of all that we experience. Excuse me, we are not. We are receivers, we are the grateful, or should be grateful, recipients of some enormous gift that we only partly understand. And we have a responsibility to respond to that. That's, of course, at the root of responsibility is this idea you have to respond to something. And that something is calling to us to behave in a different way. So obviously, one of the things I would say is that we need to open up the minds of those who are both now in control and will control our futures to the idea of, we don't understand this, we don't know what it is, but let us find the good in it, the beautiful in it, and what is true about it. Because at the moment, I don't think there's ever been a period since recorded time that I know of when truth has been so profoundly travestied. And with the development of AI, it's going to be almost impossible for education, for the law, for politics to function if we don't know whether something is a video clip that is made up by a computer showing a politician saying things he never said. When we get to that, and how do we know that the children or the young people we're teaching have really understood anything if they can generate an essay that will satisfy an examiner? It's going to negate all the things on which a civilization is built. And what a civilization is for is to guarantee that we are better at seeing the beautiful, the good, and the true, which to me are, with the sacred, which goes above it, is the most important value of all.
Yeah, no, and this is one of the central risks that people don't see in terms of catastrophic risk is the true collapse of culture and truth at this and value, because what occurs there is basically, and I'm not going to steal Benito Roy's thunder, but basically it's like a schizophrenic break at the level of culture, where the entire culture gets out of touch with the ability to perceive value, and AI is the thing that could perpetrate that break. I wonder too, though, about the relationship between depression in the hemispheres and traumatic experience in the hemispheres. So part of me is like, okay, you think you can control the world, and you kind of can pretend you can for a while until it slaps you in the face and something occurs that forces your identity to reorient. Because I'm thinking, like, what is the actual human development process when someone actually reorients their basic hemispheric dominance pattern? Maybe that's too simple a way to think, but I wonder if, at various points in history where we seem to step in and speak from, the master, were times sometimes after very hard lessons were learned. And so I'm wondering if one of the things that will reawaken the perception of value is actually the occurrence of catastrophe and tragedy.
Yes, I think that's right. And I wouldn't cast it myself in terms of depression, trauma, and the hemispheres, because that's just too complicated. I mean, I think there's something in it. And that I devote a whole chapter in The Matter with Things to showing what the correspondences are between a left hemisphere dominated picture of the world and a right hemisphere deficient picture of the world, and that of the subject with schizophrenia. So that is very much like left hemisphere overdrive, and it's been commented before I drew these parallels by people like Louis Sass, that something seems to be happening to our culture which is rather like what happens in schizophrenia. And of course, schizophrenia is a very distressing condition which often does lead individually to suicide. I believe that we are actually pursuing our own suicide very rapidly at the moment. We are disemboweling our culture and destroying all the good in it. We are disemboweling and destroying the beauty and the vibrance of nature. And we've turned our backs on the sacred and the divine and said that these are just childish fantasies, whereas they're probably the most important realities. They're not easy to find for us now. So I don't disrespect somebody who can't find them and can't see what is meant by them. And indeed, I think that the talk about them is quite problematic, and no doubt I'll talk to someone else in another session about that. But nevertheless, I think these values are hugely important, and we are losing them. It might be worth just mentioning, because I think it's something helpful to me, I found, which is Shaler's pyramid of values. I'm talking here not about Schiller, but Shaler, Max Shaler, Scheler, who was an early 20th century German phenomenological philosopher, said by Heidegger to be the brightest philosopher in Europe of his generation. And he wrote about values in a way that Heidegger himself didn't, nor actually did Wittgenstein to the same extent. Although in Culture and Value, I find he writes beautifully about these things. But in any case, Max Scheler had a pyramid of values, a hierarchy, and at the bottom were those of use, i.e. utility and pleasure. And then somewhat above that were what he called die Lebenswerte, the values of life. And he meant by these things like generosity and courage and magnanimity and loyalty. And then above that came effectively what he called die geistige Werte, meaning either the intellectual or the spiritual values, which are, I believe, beauty, goodness, and truth principally. And other values that you might mention are effectively derivative from either beauty, goodness, or truth, that we value them because we think they are either good, or we think they're beautiful, or we think they're true. And then on the top of this pyramid was the sacred. And what I suggest is that in our own time, we have inverted this pyramid so that the left hemisphere's value is at the top, that of utility, and the other ones are said to be simply in service to utility. That is the vision of the materialist reductionists, who until recently have held the floor in the universities. That, thank goodness, is changing. There is a wonderful move afoot I see in philosophy, I see in biology, that people see that this very simplistic, mechanistic vision is gone. It's over. It just doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, thank you for all that. That was intriguing. I'd been saying for some time that we were dealing with basically a suicidal culture that was running in overdrive down into those patterns. So I'm going to reflect us from getting too much into that. But your enumeration there of the hierarchy of values gets into Jonathan's point about values versus value. And is there some structure to the organization of first principles and first values? Like the core of the work that I'm doing at the Frontier for Wisdom is that enumerating first principles and first values from a perspective of continuity with evolution itself, so that there are some values which are periphery, which occur locally, and then there are other values which are so core that we can actually say that we share them with like animals and that we share them perhaps with cells, right? That the value pre-exists us, then there's a continuity of value that we participate in. And so things like harmony, right? Like harmony is expressed very early in physics, where you either get some things that work or do not work. And if you think about multicellular organisms or complex organisms, a lot of what's occurring there is complex systems of integrous, harmonious things. Humans start to use speech, they start to try to name values, and you get something like justice or fairness as a continuation of this dimension of so that's some of the thing we're doing there. And what emerges is that there's a paucity of language of evaluation in our culture. So this is a point Charles Taylor makes. He talks about languages of strong evaluation being the core of what holds a culture together. And that means a language of shared value. We talk about a universal grammar of value is absent. We can kind of have a grammar to talk about mathematics and science and all of these other things, but when we get together and we try to have a conversation about value, our tongues are tied. And especially if we move beyond our own culture. So there's this need to create some new languages of value, I think,
How much do you think that depends on the level at which one is talking about value? And I've sort of set up a kind of an idea of certain values, such as beauty, goodness, and truth, and it would almost make no sense to say up to a point about these things. We just do think beauty is good. We do think goodness is good. We do think that truth is good. It's almost a tautology.
Yeah.
But if you start talking about the values that we hold as a society, and one may go back to the call of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and these sound like a very good start. But immediately one finds oneself, and this is where one might get tongue-tied and there might be conflict, is, but what exactly do we mean by these things, and in what context, and how much, and for whom? So liberty is, on the face of it, highly desirable, and I certainly wouldn't admire a culture in which there was no liberty. But obviously, utterly untrammeled liberty is anarchy, and restraints and constraints within reason are very important, and we, a mature society, is able to balance those things. And you know, it's true of equality and fraternity. You know, what exactly does one mean by them? Are they always necessarily good in all contexts, or do we have to finesse them? And I think that's what I would think is the difficulty about values themselves. Perhaps the only way in which one can resurrect a good sense of values is, in fact, by looking at societies that have been stable for a long time and produced that harmony that you, thank you for mentioning that, because I think it's terribly important. And it's not only a very important idea in physics, but also, as you point out, in biology. And also, of course, it was foundational in Greek thinking, you know, from Pythagoras onwards.
And it's one of those things you can see, like you can see.
Yes,
it. Like
and you can hear it.
It's one of the problems.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a remarkable and suffuses. I remember this quote by Whitehead again, where he says, you know, the circle haunts the universe like a ghost. And what he was talking about was just the presence of universals amongst the flux.
Yes.
Right? And so harmony kind of haunts evolution at all stages, and we yearn for it. Like in our societies, we want harmony, and so it's interesting that.
And what harmony points out is it's all in relations. It's not unison, it's relations between things, but beautiful and generous relations that work together to produce only good and beautiful sound. So, you know, and we talk about other species and humans, and you talked about how harmony seems to be very much a kind of human conception. I think you hinted that. At any rate, I hope I'm not misquoting you. But it is also true that, you know, birds sing, but in essence they sing competitively. But only humans can sing in harmony and attune their voices to one another. So this is, I mean, there's so much that one can regret about humanity, but the trouble with this is that it leads to a kind of disparagement of everything that humanity can be. And we need to preserve the ideal of what a human being and a human life and a human society can be, what its meaning is, at the same time as being highly critical of many of the things that it's now interpreted as involving. And this comes down to my basic point, and the reason I wrote The Matter with Things, is that we no longer understand what a human being is, what the world is, and what we're here in it for.
Right, and that's very unfortunate.
That's very unfortunate.
And I believe in the Master and Emissary, you cited that research that the vocal cords were more developed before the language centers. So the very first humans communicated mostly through song, basically, that there was this kind of Eden state where there was this harmonic vocalization of somewhat sapient, you know, bipedal creatures who were basically singing together before they were speaking, and that the function of language, to be denotative and descriptive, piggybacked on the use of the vocal cords for basically harmony.
Yes. Well, you know, I mean, this is I have to rely here quite a lot on anthropologists, but there is a prominent school of anthropologists who certainly believe this, Stephen Meithen being one of the best known exponents of it. But what I think is nice is that there is very good, if you like, anatomical reasons for believing that this is the case, and from the examination of animals, their ability to vocalize and so on, the nature of their skulls and their rib cages. Too much to explain now, but it's in the Master and His Emissary. But what I love about it is that it inverts this assumption that all the business is done with language, and music is just some frivolous exaptation of language. But actually, it turns out that the science is on the side that music comes first, and that language is a useful exaptation of music.
Exactly, that's the idea. And were we being stopped? Was that a bell to intervene, Jonathan?
No, it's just that I'm part of my hopelessly a-tech world. There's a grandfather clock sitting just in the next.
Oh, so it was just the
Sorry.
Good.
I am ready to come in, Zach, but carry on for now. And a couple of minutes.
And this is just it's a very deep point about what society ought to be like and things that, in fact, we
miss. It's a knell that's summons us to heaven or to hell. Sorry, no, carry on. It is. Sorry, Zach. Carry on.
Very pivotal moment in the conversation now. So the point is both that we misunderstand theoretically the function of language, thinking that its primary function is denotative and descriptive, when in fact there's a deeper function, which is the resonance it allows for between us.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting, like as someone who's done some clinical work, when you listen to someone speak, you're often not listening to what they say. You're listening to the tone and tenor and anxiety or absence of anxiety and the prosody and the pace of their speech and all the musical tones, basically, not the content. And in fact, the mismatch between content and that underlying musicality is a sign to pay attention to. So it's just interesting to think that, in fact, something as basic as language, the hemispheres are allowing us to misunderstand subtly, and that harmony suffuses this organism, and it resonates with it, and the chanting and the music, and then the notion that in the human the value of harmony becomes aware of itself, and so we actually arrange. And this is the kind of an interesting note that runs through a couple of places in the Matter of Things, that there's something that occurs with the human as an evolutionary emergent, where value and consciousness become aware of themselves in ways that they were not previously. And this is a big thing.
I think that's a really important point, and it goes back to my idea, which I think is absolutely consonant with my understanding of Whitehead, which is that whatever we mean by God, the creative force, logos, li, burta, whatever it may be, that is bringing the cosmos into being, and the cosmos is bringing it further into being, so that each is unfolding and discovering more of its potential in this dynamic relationship. It's not a story of a static something that just is, or of two static somethings, but of a twofold relationship in which something is ever more coming into being. That seems to be at the center of creation. And if there's one thing one can say about the cosmos, it is that it is creative in this way. That is one of the primary values, if you like, of the cosmos, is simply to make things happen, to differentiate out of an enormously potential unity, all that potential means when it's unfolded, and then to refold it again into a now enriched unity, which then carries on this process. It's an alternation. And of course, this is very much in keeping with David Bohm's idea of the implicit order, the explicit order, and then being re-enfolded into the implicit order.
Yeah, we speak of evolving value, or evolving eternal value.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. To think about it. And in the Kabbalistic tradition, there's a saying that there's more God to come, which is basically
I didn't know that. If you can give me the reference to that, because I'm very keen on the Kabbalah, and I've never heard that. But I argue, of course, that the Kabbalah actually sees that, that whatever is the ground of being ends off is actually coming into being.
Yeah, no, and that's the root of this work, because it's the collaboration with Rabbi Gaffney and Ken Wilber, who are both esotericists. And Gaffney's command of the Kabbalistic literature, and it's part of the through line of the matter with things is the line back through Schelling, through Boheme to the Renaissance, basically Christian Kabbalists. And metaphysics is implicit there, which is of this, where God invests in the cosmos the ability to basically further the divine, to create new God. And so as something like harmony evolves, or beauty evolves, the intensification of the value evolves forever. And we participate in that, self-aware, either creating value or taking value. So it's a kind of...
We either participate in it or fail to do so. And that is the tragedy, that at the moment we're failing to do so.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Thank you, Zak and Iain. I'm aware that you guys can talk for hours further, and I hope you will at some point. And I'm very glad you've met, and I feel very validated by the decision to bring you together. And I hope it's the first of many conversations, because I'm aware that you share depths and common interests that are sometimes esoteric and are sometimes extremely difficult, but of fundamental importance. And you're both first principles thinkers in a way that the world currently needs. So I'm very grateful to have you here and bring you together. But I'm also conscious we have 330 odd people, some of whom are keen to ask you things. I'll ask you something myself first, but just to allow the audience to sort of warm up, I am keen, as a point of principle in these sessions, that we try and ask a question about what's just been spoken of. Not to revert back to McGilchrist 101, as I say. Of course, you may have more fundamental queries, but it would be good, because we've just shared something together, that we focus on what we've heard. With that in mind, I am feeling significantly clearer about my sort of inquiry earlier vis-a-vis the mapping of the relationship between values and so on. But I'm also curious about something that is sort of point related to that, and it came up in the last session too. For all the bashing of the left hemisphere, Iain, and I know you're quite famous for saying that the left hemisphere is your second favorite hemisphere, and that it's one to be loved and cherished, and it shouldn't be knocked down. I feel this work that I feel responsible for, and that Perspective is engaged in, of working with first principles thinkers like yourselves, trying to make sense of what they're really saying philosophically about the nature of reality and our capacity to know it, maybe love it, relate to it. There is a certain dignified, beautiful role for the left hemisphere in taking a few moments as emissary, just to get clear about what exactly the master is saying, right?
Absolutely.
Right? And that's why when I occasionally feel almost guilty, like part of me has a kind of weird socio-epistemic guilt about trying to map these things mentally in a kind of cartography, because I feel, shouldn't I just be presencing? Shouldn't I just be with this? Shouldn't I be playing some music or doing some art here? Instead, I'm trying to sort of craft out with these words in a bubble chart how they link together. And I think, no, surely it's not that. Nonetheless, what I was trying to get at, Iain, is that you mentioned Scheller's hierarchy, or rather structure thereof, of the sacred giving rise to sort of fundamental truth, beauty, and goodness. And then you make mention of this more derivative values. And that's useful. But what I was left wondering is, if value is primordial and pre-human, and in some sense something that life is for us to be in relationship with, as you argue in the book, you go on to have a chapter on the sacred. But help me out here with the distinction, not between values plural and the sacred, but values singular and the sacred. How can we make a distinction between them that's useful to make sense of what's being said here?
First of all, I should just comment that Scheler doesn't imply that the sacred gives rise to the next lower line of the pyramid and so on down to utility. He simply says that there is a hierarchy of values and that some are simply more important than others. They are more central, if you like, to the business of leading a fulfilled human life. What I would say, my answer to it also touches on what you've just said about the importance of the left hemisphere, that it's good that it should, as it were, question and try and make clearer to itself what it is that the master is talking about. But it has to do so knowing that at the end of the day, whatever it can come up with falls short of whatever it is the master is saying. So the process is useful in that things come out of it, but that at the end of the day, it's not going to have an equivalent map and say, I've got the master's message now and it's all this, because that would automatically be wrong. So having said that, what I think we can see is that the sacred is something that is dark. The mystics talk about it as a kind of visible darkness, a light that's so bright that in fact for us it is invisible or impenetrable or unknowable. Now, if that is the case, what happens is that when it passes through a prism, we can then perhaps begin to see it. The light is somehow softened, filtered. And the prism through which that light of the sacred comes is the one that generates, in my view, beauty, goodness, and truth, that these are manifestations of it, that the creation can respond to, and that are its principal lures that are calling to us to go to it. Does that help?
I mean, it's beautiful. Before I can decide whether it has utility in the sense of helping, so already I'm feeling the right sort of relative importance of things. It does help, and it doesn't need to be pristine. There was a moment I shared this with Zak prior to the call. Many of you will know George Lakoff and his work on sort of the representation of concepts, particularly being embodied and sort of often grounded in metaphors of the body. So, an idea is big for example, or you can you can play with notions of something being a long shot, and there's these sort of expressions which get at the idea that the way the mind organizes itself conceptually is through these spatial metaphors. And I found myself having a moment reading your chapter 26 where I was going, okay, so you've got this value that's sort of primordial and pre-human and fundamental. And then you have love, which comes up, and you speak about the relationship between love. And then you have meaning, and you have purpose, and not just any old purpose, but cosmological, teleological purpose. And I'm trying my mind to actually see this in space. So I had this moment of sort of, whatever that's called, eidectic imagery, or whatever that word is for the sort of thing in your mind. And I was trying to sort of, trying to picture that in my mind. And I suddenly realized how absurd the whole thing was, in the sense that I couldn't possibly capture it, because it somehow was, as you say, always going to be an inadequate representation of what was actually being described. And it was very useful. It was a sort of micro spiritual experience of sorts, because there was definitely a sense of these fundamental features of the universe: love, truth, beauty, goodness, value, the sacred, meaning, purpose. There's a lot of them, right? It's a family. And you've said before, vis-a-vis the McGilchrist maneuver, just as the one as many, the many as one. So it's not true that they're all the same. They're, and there's one sense the same, and another sense they're not. And when you try and hold that in your mind and actually see how they map together as if it was some kind of flowchart, the only answer is a kind of laughter, because it doesn't really work. And it's a liberation in some ways that it doesn't work. And yet there's still a part of me that's a little bit uneasy. And I'm curious if anyone else feels that way. Well, and if Zak or Iain has anything to comment before other people come in. I'll start looking at people's questions now while you're answering that.
Okay, well, I'd just like to respond, since, well, your point is aimed at what I've been saying, I suppose. I agree with that idea that there seem to be a family of these things, but another way of looking at it is that I didn't put love in as a value, because I think love is the grounding, the nature of being, whatever. And the sacred is our sense of that ground of being. And you could say that that ground of being, call it God, whatever one wants to call it, but the ultimate essence of the creation of the cosmos, is itself purposeful, that it generates automatically, not as an extra thing, not as a sort of subsequently, now I'm going to have a purpose, but it is purposive. Love is purposive. It is ultimately aimed towards something, that it's directed, it is relational automatically. But I wouldn't again make relation another separate thing. The trouble is that we're so in hoc to things, and I almost called this book There Are No Things, because it isn't a thing, truth and beauty and goodness, but what we're really trying to adumbrate is the nature of this loving core that is in itself true, that is in itself beautiful. What it does is automatically good, although that is something that theologians could dispute. Is it good because God automatically goes there, or does God go there because it's good, and so forth. But what I'm really saying in brief is that these are different unfoldings of a single element, the multiplicities, the many strands that do nothing to in any way imperil the integrity of the whole, but in fact enhance it.
Okay. Yeah, the closest thing would be like a field, right? So we speak of a field of value. There's a unified field of value, but it's not featureless.
Yes.
This basic property of the unified field would be eros. We talk about eros. So we talk about cosmoerotic humanism, in which eros is the foundational field root of value, but then all of these values differentiate out. But some have existed since the Big Bang, and others are more recent. But yeah, they're not things, and therefore when you flow chart them, and even when you try to sequence them in a strict way, you can't. The left hemisphere will do that at lower moral stages of development, but maturity, as deepening into value perception, sees inevitable value conflict. And again, it's not a harmonious picture in its totality. Whitehead speaks about the intensification of polarities, not about everything getting better, but about the intensification of the polarities and dynamics of values, all co-evolving in tension and erotic, kind of like basically self-disclosure. So
erotic self-disclosure. Okay. I'm very grateful for your questions. Yeah. The questions are very good. And we'll come to them very quickly, moving swiftly along. So I'm conscious that we may not get through all of them, but we're going to try and get to the best ones at least. I'm also conscious that for many who are of a philosophical mindset, some of this discussion will have been delicious and exactly the kind of their staple diet, if you like. But for others who are a more practical mindset, perhaps less philosophically, adept, it can seem a little abstract. So I have a really good question here, which is principally for Zak, actually, although I'm sure Iain will have thoughts on it. Because I happen to know that Zak has written a great deal about propaganda and thought about it at length and written about it on the Consilience Project website. And we're in a time of intense propaganda. Zak, the question here is from Kevin Kotwas, if I've said that correctly. And he just says, can you talk about the weaponization of value in propaganda? And I'm sure Iain has thoughts too, but if you could begin.
Yeah, I mean, a few things to say there. One, and I mentioned it already, that preference falsification being the foundation of advertising.
Just clarify what you mean by that, because I didn't quite get it the first time.
Preference falsification is when you think you value something, but you actually don't truly value it. You've kind of been tricked into valuing it. Sometimes through coercion, sometimes through tricks of psychology. So it's like preference falsification is the goal of of advertising. Advertising was one of the main places where psychology was operationalized after World War II, coming out of large-scale propaganda programs that were built during the Cold War. And so you're looking at a science of persuasive communication. And if everything we're saying is true about the intrinsic nature of value and the way the human nervous system responds to value, then if I'm trying to get you to do something and I'm a psychologist and I know that, then the first thing I do is manipulate your value systems and your value preferences. So without even speaking about propaganda, just staying on advertising, we can see that the saturation of that kind of persuasive to the point of being coercive style of communication is one of the things that has undermined our ability to perceive actual value.
Right.
So that's the idea, is that if you're succeeding as an advertiser, you're not just getting them to value what you want them to value, like Coca-Cola, right? Like, why do we drink Coca-Cola? Right? It's actually bad for you. But people really want to drink Coca-Cola. The main reason you want to drink Coca-Cola is because of advertising. And they've been doing it for decades now. They're very good at it. It's very subtle. So they're making you want something, making you perceive something as value, but it's not actually valuable.
Just to play devil's advocate for Coca-Cola here, I feel like I'm on the BBC or something trying to be impartial. I mean, all know how that goes. But I was going to say, it's not just caffeine and sugar. Don't I just want the caffeine and sugar and some sweeteners?
Yes, but that's, again, part of the falsification of value. What you want is to feel good.
Right.
What you actually want is to feel good. And the falsification of value goes right down into your actual body and limbic system. And
Right.
so like when we send our boys over there with World War II, they were not in a position to really know geopolitically what was going on. They were in a position to have been told what was going on, right? And they fought for their country with love, with full flux of value, as a result of propaganda. And again, propaganda is very complex to discuss because there's a thin line between propaganda and education.
Right.
And it becomes the evil twin of education is propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them piggyback on valueception. Both of them deploy strategies of getting you to value something.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you, Zach. That's why your question to Iain earlier about how one begins to cultivate, refine, develop the capacity for valueception is culturally critical, almost a matter of civilizational survival. And it doesn't just apply sort of in the classroom, but it also applies more in the front line of culture, influencing our everyday activity.
And then because values are values, they are also explicitly thematized reflectively by propagandists. So like the culture wars are a result of both sides trying to create conflict around value and values. Right. So it's important to get that. One of the things that makes it hard to talk about values is that they've been subject to, at least in the United States, to a kind of internal informational civil war, where just like in the 30 Years' War, the different visions of heaven and hell and other things were used by propagandists to get the Protestants and the Catholics to really fear and hate one another. Similarly, now digital propaganda is working us into a frenzy, mostly along these value fault lines, which are identified and then cleaved, and like salt is thrown on the wound, and they're trying to make the value conflict as polarized and difficult as possible. So there's tons to say, but because it's
I know you have no lack of things to say on propaganda. And for those who are interested, if you go to the Consilience Project, there's, I believe, 3 very considered erudite essays on propaganda that Zach's written there. Maybe Michael, if you can put that in the chat, if you can find it, but it is there. Iain, any thoughts on propaganda before we come on to other things?
I think Zach covered it perfectly, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. And I thought the point about education and propaganda being evil twins and sometimes being confused with one another, particularly important at the moment.
Right, I agree. This is quite a more refined sort of philosophical question, but a pretty important one, because I've fallen into this trap myself. It's by Andrew M. Davis. Much of this conversation has bounced between aesthetic and moral value. A lot of bouncing. Whitehead makes the claim that moral order is merely certain aspects of aesthetic order. Here, aesthetic order is wider and deeper than moral value. How do you understand here's the question. How do you understand the relationship between aesthetic and moral order? Is one more ontologically primitive than the other? So it's an A plus for the question there, Andrew. What's the answer, Zak and Iain? Iain, do you want to go first?
Yes, okay. It's a good question, and it's one that I do tackle a bit in at least in this chapter, I think. Beauty is a difficult one because, you know, I'm a great admirer of Keats, but he did die when he was 26, and he was a poet. He wasn't on oath as a philosopher, as it were, when he said that beauty is truth, truth, beauty. This is all ye know and all ye need to know. If it were as simple as that, we wouldn't have two quite distinct terms, and the questioner wouldn't have used them. Nor would Whitehead have thought that these words were worth preserving, because I can think of things that are beautiful and definitely not good, and I can think of things that are good that are definitely not beautiful, unless you, I mean, it's always open to somebody to so twist the meaning of a word that it will now encompass, but in the way we normally use them, they're different. So it caused me more trouble than anything to be able to deal with these. And it's interesting that whereas moral values seem much more distinctly carved up between the right and left hemispheres, as David Hecht at UCL says, the right hemisphere basically deals in good, and the left in what is morally bad. I mean, that's his words, or a paraphrase of them, and so it's much easier. Whereas with the matter of beauty, both hemispheres do get involved with it and do contribute to it. Although to go into the niceties of it, I would take us too long and too far. Right. I don't agree, in short, with Whitehead on this particular point. Andrew knows that I'm a great Whiteheadian. But on this one, I just can't really agree with it, because it seems to me that in a way we value beauty because ultimately it is good. But we don't value good ultimately because it's beautiful. That's the way I see it. Maybe that's a product of my modern Western European education and a degree of Protestantism in the background that I've overlaid heavily with other strands, but I don't know. That's my take on it. What do you say, Zak?
I mean, I'm not sure either, but I think about just the big three, the good, the true, and the beautiful, having been differentiated for quite a long time. So there's something to the value of that differentiation, that in modernity they became disassociated, and you had science running hegemonic over the good and the true. But I also think of Kant and the structure of the three critiques, right? And then at the end, Kant basically is saying that it reduces down to this very complex form of aesthetic judgment, which is more than just the judgment of beauty. It's also the ability to perceive the teleological, to perceive value per se, would be my reading of the third critique, in which case there is something that is neither of those three that's more deep. So if I think about the sacred, I think sometimes that's just an intensification of all three at once, and that there's something like a deeper field of allurement or eros that is primary to the emergence of even the differentiation of those three. And there's a story that Weber tells and Habermas tells about the differentiation of those value spheres after their pre-modern synthesis, that there was a time when they were merged in the idea of the sacred, that slowly they were differentiated out. Habermas talks about the linguistification of the sacred and the differentiation out of those three, and then eventually the asymmetry that emerged with the unbounded rationality of modernity. So that's me not really answering the question, but talking about what I know about the question.
What?
Yeah, please.
But if I could just quickly come back for a couple of things. Sure. The first is that your invocation of Kant shows perfectly what I mean by what one can achieve by redefining what one means by beauty. Because if you call this aesthetic, then you are enlarging the meaning beyond what most people normally use it to mean. In order, like Humpty Dumpty, you're allowed to do that. But then, have you really achieved anything by applying this particular term to it? And the other is just to say that I think your illumination, that the sacred is all three of these combined, is just perfect. Because this is what I was saying about the light being differentiated through colored glass. But when the colors are separated, one doesn't call red blue, but nonetheless, in the light, they are together.
Right. It occurs to me, Zak, and I know, Iain, you know Daniel Schmachtenberger as well a little bit, but Daniel has said in a couple of his talks, I've heard him say, and I don't know whether he still holds to this philosophically, but it's a very elegant line. He says, I wouldn't really care about goodness and truth if it wasn't for beauty. That was his way of putting it. It was that something about the charm and sort of intuitive elegance and attraction of beauty was sort of primary, that it sort of drew you. And, this is how I understand his claim. There was something about beauty that was the prior motivation to look at goodness and truth. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's exactly how he means it, but for what it's worth, he said it. And I find it quite an elegant a proposition or provocation to think about. But Iain, you've already answered adequately why that might not be the whole story. And likewise, Zak.
Yes.
I want to get to some other questions, and I can see we still have, let's see, quite a few more. Michael, do you want to take a shot and answer it yourself?
Yep, I'm happy to. Jonathan, thanks for that. Yeah, so I guess my question stems from the fact that I feel this view that is being put forth here, that value is ontologically fundamental. If that was to take hold more broadly in society and culture, I feel it could be very, very powerful, like a very, very powerful view to transform our way of relating to life. And I guess, before I ask this question, I'm aware that it might be my left hemisphere grasping after certainty, but I'm wondering, and this is really for both of you, Zak and Iain, how likely is it, do you think, that in time, the evidence for this will become more and more compelling? Like, do you see that the new scientific findings will start to make a compelling case for the fact that we can actually quite convincingly say, no, value is ontologically fundamental? Zak, you mentioned about how we see maybe in biology values that seem to be existent out with any need for human beings to exist. So I'm kind of thinking in those terms. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Will I have something to say first, and then you, Zak? Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, as I always say, predicting is a fool's game, but I don't think that science will ever answer this question or shed a great deal of light on it. It's a philosophical question of a kind that science is not really equipped to answer, I would say. And, that's no disrespect to science, but there are certain places science won't take us profitably. I think, though, that it may become more vivid to us when the over-sophisticated, over-technical, over-scientistic way of conceiving ourselves has been blown away by a collapse, some kind of cataclysm that will lead to suffering. And here I go back to something that I think Zak was, I think, getting at when he talked about or hinted at the idea that suffering might actually enable us to see certain things that otherwise we wouldn't. And I do think that in a paradoxical way, but then that I profoundly believe in the coincidence of opposites, that the way in which things will get better is actually by getting worse. That in doing that, our vision will become clearer, our responses will become more natural, and we will see what matters. And that that which matters to us and which will enable us to survive, will to be able to trust people and to achieve something which really exemplifies goodness, truth, and beauty. And you might say, but in circumstances of dereliction, would beauty matter? And in the book, I emphasize that the earliest human artifacts that we know about are beautiful and seem as what was he called, the chap who did 100 the history of the world in 100 objects, suddenly forgotten his name, Neil, the director of the British Museum, for heaven's sake, what was he called?
I don't know.
Anyway, well, anyway, you surely know about the history of the world in 100 objects. Anyway, no.
Yeah, but not the author.
No, okay. Yes, I mean, he's very well known, but his name's suddenly gone. But anyway, he said that one of the things that he noticed was that when we first started making things, the simplest, hand axes, we required them to be beautiful as much as we required them to be of utility.
Right.
Yeah.
And I quote a consultation on a school in Mexico where the parents in a very poor area were going to be gifted with a school, and they were asked what above all they would value in that school. And the first thing they said was that they wanted it to be beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, the return to value at the core of culture is inevitable if culture is to survive. It's one almost like a symptom of the state of our civilization is the degree to which we are removing value from the center of culture. And what's interesting is that the native disposition of the human is to respond to value still. So we haven't been completely dehumanized yet. And there's evidence to show that, like, during natural disasters and when other things occur, people spontaneously do heroic things, they spontaneously collaborate, that the number of people who go completely sociopathic is actually much smaller than you'd think, that our spontaneous action under complete adrenal overload is basically to respond to immediate value and save that baby and get this person water and just do what needs to be done. It's a fallback position of the human nervous system that's evolved to respond to basic value. So
Yes, and Green and Paxton have also demonstrated, much to their surprise, that the default position for us is to be honest, and that lying is actually stressful and difficult, not that we are naturally deceitful. So I think these things are really important that you just said. Sorry.
Just that we have a few minutes left, and I've been brought to task, and quite rightly, for the gender imbalance in the questions, and it was entirely because I hadn't seen askable questions, but I believe there's one from Claire. I can't see you, Claire, very easily on the screen, but if you're there, please let it be known to us with a hand up, and that'll make it easier to find you. I know what your question was roughly, but it'd be better if you can ask it in your own voice.
It's early morning here, and it's in Wellington, New Zealand, and
welcome.
Thank you. No, it just sparked my attention was that when you were saying I'm a PhD student and I'm dealing with these topics, and I've very much focused on the idea that of the paradigm shift to make consciousness fundamental to matter. And matter is secondary and consciousness is primary. I'm looking at that issue. And then you said that value is fundamental. And I thought, well, how many things can be fundamental? And if value and consciousness are both fundamental, what's the relationship between the two of them? And are there other qualities that can be defined as fundamental?
Good question, and perhaps I could just have a quick stab at that. I myself hold that consciousness is an ontological primitive and that matter is an aspect of consciousness. But it seems to me that consciousness is intrinsically relational, that consciousness is always consciousness towards or consciousness of something else. And therefore immediately comes into the question the nature of this relationship. And if there is a relationship, And maybe one would say that it is intrinsic. And here I'm not multiplying entities, but just saying these are other facets that one can talk about love. Love is intrinsically relational. It is intrinsically beautiful. It is intrinsically good. It is intrinsically true when it is a true love. So these things are, I mean, we get tied up in linguistic knots, but it's not that there are a whole cupboard full of entities. And we come back to my point that there's a problem when we reify things, whereas all we're really alluding to is different qualities of this primal whatever it is. That would be my answer. Zak?
Thank you, Zak.
Do you have anything?
It's a very deep question. And as I alluded to before, I would take consciousness, matter, time, space, motion, value as differentiations from an underlying field, which I would characterize probably as being a field of value if I had to pick one of them, which is interesting. That, again, the basic root of the cosmos is like a desire, like an appetition, like a wanting to be. And and then once you get after those, the question of, is there some more fundamental set, is one of the things that we've been working on, is a limited set of first principles and first values that would characterize cosmic evolution basically from the beginning, which we can either choose to self-consciously align with these first principles and values of the cosmos or not. And this is the view of cosmoerotic humanism as we're articulating it recently. So I'm not clear how to, that's kind of above my philosophical pay grade to make the final decision about those fundamental categories. But I do think, like, that the list that Iain gave, where you add consciousness and value to matter, time, space, and motion, that's a very important basic list. And the addition of value is just one of the most important philosophical moves that can be made in our culture today, because people kind of buy consciousness. They're kind of, even physicists are willing to buy consciousness, but the idea that the universe matters and has a purpose and that the universe responds to value, is intrinsically valuable, is a little bit like that. So the addition is just so critical, I believe, and puts the press on the hardcore left view, reductionist view. It puts them into a corner.
Okay, thank you, Zak. Is that a good enough response to the question?
Yes, I will ponder that. But the only thing is, I was thinking is that matter, time, space are all three-dimensional activities or qualities, and I'm just, I always thought things like consciousness, value, beyond maybe 3 dimensions.
So that's, again, a deep question. Iain, I had the similar experience while shifting between these things in the second volume.
Yes.
That there are different kinds of things going on that are all fundamental.
Yes, you're asking a very deep question, and my attempt to answer it very briefly will not be satisfactory. But what I would say at the moment is this: that I believe that matter is a phase of consciousness that could be considered secondary to consciousness, or could just be a way in which consciousness can manifest under certain circumstances. Its reason for doing so is to provide 2 things that consciousness can't, which is a degree of permanence and a degree of resistance. And the degree of resistance and permanence are related to one another. And why resistance is important to creation would take me a long time, but it's a theme I deal with in the book. Now, once you've got matter, it cannot, we cannot talk about anything material at all, or imagine it without the need for time and space. So when people tell me that by some mathematical jiggery-pokery they find equations in which time disappears, I would say, well, you've just cut the rug from under science and indeed philosophical discourse, because without the existence of time, we can't say anything, know anything, and we can't rely on anything that we empirically experiment with. And so we get into knots because of the limitations of our language, but also of our consciousness. We're limited beings. Let's enjoy it and let's celebrate it. But what we have is glorious. And it's up to us to, respond well to what we've been given.
Thank you, Iain. it's a great thought to end on, being limited beings. Time is one of our limitations. And we were trying, Perspectiva are trying to be disciplined about our 100-minute events, 100-minute moments, we're thinking of calling them. We're still working on it internally. But really glad that you've all shared this one with us. And there will be further events coming up. We will have one in 2 weeks. Like I say, we're not quite certain who the mystery guest is, but it's one of two people. We're currently clarifying that. In the next couple of days, that will become clear. And this will carry on for several weeks. The event is free and Perspectiva is a charity, but if you've enjoyed this event and you want to support our work, please go to our website and there is a donate button there if you feel like giving additionally to allow us to carry on doing this kind of event, carry on publishing this kind of work. And all that remains for me to say really is a very deep, heartfelt thank you to Iain McGilchrist and Zak Stein. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you too, David. And thank you for those who put questions in the chat. If it could be saved and sent to me later, I'd like to see them because I'm very interested in new light on what I'm trying to illuminate myself.
Yes. And yes, thanks a lot for the questions. And we'll hopefully see most of you again soon. And I think over and out.
It was a pleasure.
But thanks a lot. Take care and see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Very good.